Hello everyone, I am Kartik Omanakuttan, a research scholar at the Sobhan Singh Jina University, India, and I am an editorial professional at the Grassroots Institute. Some of you might recall our last interaction in the lecture for Module 1. Today we'll discuss and learn new concepts from the Module 2. The title of today's lecture, as you can see, is Wetland Ecology, Functions and Management. In the last session, we spent our time on the basics like what qualifies as a wetland, how these systems get delineated, and why they don't fit neatly into either the terrestrial or aquatic camp. Today, we go a step further. We'll look at how wetlands actually work as living systems, the hydrology that runs them, the biogeochemistry that makes them chemically strange, and the way they shift, sometimes gradually and sometimes abruptly, from one ecological state into another. From there, we move on to what they do for us: flood control, water purification, carbon storage, fisheries. Using the East Kolkata wetland as a working example of a system that pays for itself many times over. And we'll close with management, how you actually keep a wetland functioning once you know what you can go further wrong with it. From the Everglades phosphorus problem to the governance tangles around laws like the Clean Water Act. So, three broad movements: ecology, function, management, each building on the last. Introduction to wetlands. Just a quick orientation before we start. Today's session has three moving parts. That is how wetlands function ecologically, what serves they provide, and how we manage or mismanage them. Keep those three headings in mind. Almost everything that follows sit under one of them. So, wetland. For most of the 20th century, these were treated as waste ground, places to drain, fill, and build on. That view has flipped almost completely in the last few decades, and the reason is fairly simple. Once you actually measure what these systems are doing hydrologically and chemically, wastelands stop making sense as a label. A wetland is really defined by three things occurring together, not any one of them alone. You need the right hydrology, meaning a periodic or permanent inundations. You need soils that have gone anaerobic as a result. And you need vegetation that has actually adapted to survive in that low oxygen soil. If you miss one of the three and you don't have a wetland in the technical sense, you have something else. A floodplain, maybe, that dries out too often. For example, a pond with no hydric soil underneath it. This three-part definition is also why wetland delineation is a legal exercise as much as an ecological one. Regulators use exactly this framework to decide what counts as protected. Classification system. The coordinating system developed by the US Fish and Wildlife Service organizes wetland by where they sit in the landscape rather than by vegetation type first. Marine and estuaries systems sit at the coastal end. Move inland and you get riverine channels, lacustrines, which is basically deep lake systems over 2 meters, and palostream, which covers your inland marshes and bogs. The useful thing about this hierarchy is that landscape position predicts a lot about hydrology before you have even looked at a single point. Then the Ramsar framework of classification. Ramsar takes a broader view, like 42 wetland types grouped into marine and coastal island and human made. That last category is the interesting one, the human made. Rice paddies, aquaculture ponds, sewage treatment wetlands. Ramsar explicitly counts these as wetlands with real conservation value, not just artificial land use. That matters because it means some managed rice paddy can function as genuinely stopover habitat for migratory shorebirds, which is not something you'd expect if you were still thinking of wetlands as only pristine and untouched systems. Then the major wetland types and the characteristics. The table that you're seeing is really the cheat sheet for the whole next section. Four types, that is bog, fen, swamp, and marsh. And they separate out on just two axes, that is whether the soil is peat or mineral and what kind of plant life dominates it. Keep this table in your head. Everything in the next slide builds directly off it. Marshes and swamps both sit on mineral, non-peat soil. The difference between them is just vegetation structure. Herbaceous plants in a marsh versus trees in a swamp. Box and fens are the peat accumulators, and the distinction there comes down to water source. Bogs are rain fed only, that is ombrotrophic, which makes them acidic and nutrient poor. Fens, they get underground, that is groundwater input, so they run alkaline and somewhat richer. That single difference in water source cascades into completely different plant communities and completely different microbial chemistry underneath it. Where wetlands form is not random. You can see the global distribution of wetland. It's governed by where topography traps water and where the water table breaks the surface. The West Siberian lowland, it is the largest single wetland complex on the planet, something around 2.7 million square kilometers. The Amazon basin, it holds enormous floodplains, forests, and mangrove areas. And within that basin, you get systems like the Llanos de Moxos in Bolivia, essentially, which is a huge seasonal savanna wetland mosaic. None of these are local curiosities. They're large enough to influence regional and even global carbon and water cycles. So, this slide that you're saying, it just puts numbers to the system we mentioned. Hudson Bay lowland, around 80 million acres. It supports polar bears and wolverines along its edges. The West Siberian lowland, it runs to roughly 640 million acres, nearly 7 times the size of Germany, with winters lasting 5 to almost 7 months. Llanos de Moxos in Bolivia, it is about the size of North Dakota and holds over 500 bird species alone. And the Everglades, comparatively small, at 1.5 million acres. It still supports manatees, crocodiles, and panthers. We'll come back to the Everglades in details later as our main case study. Now we move on to the wetland ecology. This is where we shift from what wetlands look like to how they actually run. That is the mechanisms underneath the classification system we just covered. So global taxonomic dominance. Here's the number that actually it usually surprises people that wetlands cover about 6% of Earth's land surface, yet they hold roughly 40% of all known living species. That's not a small skew, you know. It's one of the most disproportionate biodiversity concentrations in any biome category. About 75% of commercially important fish and shellfish depend on wetland at some point in their life cycle, usually as nursery habitats. And on the flip side, over a quarter of wetland species are currently at elevated extinction risk, mostly from habitat loss. So, high richness and high vulnerability are sitting in the same 6% of the planet. This slide is dense, so let's take it by trophic layers. Plants, the hydrophytes, they differ by wetland type. Sphagnum mosses, they dominate peatlands and are genuinely called ecosystem engineers because they acidified their own surroundings. Cattails and reeds, they dominate marshes. Mangroves, cypress, and tupelo, they dominate swamps. Below the plants, the decomposers community, that is bacteria and fungi, they actually drive most of the energy flow here, more than grazing does. Because so much of wetland productivity ends up as dead organic matter rather than being eaten alive. That microbial biomass then feeds protozoans and rotifers. Then insects, snails, crabs, and grass shrimps form the invertebrate base. And at the top, you've got the vertebrates, most people associate with wetlands. That is waterfowl, wading birds, amphibians, and mammals like beavers, muskrats, and otters, several of which are themselves ecosystem engineers through their damming and burrowing behavior. Hydrology, the master variable. If there's one concept to take from this whole ecology section, it's this one. Hydrology isn't just a factor among many in a wetland, it's the variable that sets almost everything else in motion. What matters specifically is the hydro period, the seasonal pattern of how deep and how long the water sits. Even a small shift in water table depth can flip soil from an aerobic to an anaerobic state within hours. And that single chemical switch triggers a whole cascade of downstream biochemical changes, which is why hydrology gets called the master variable rather than just one variable among several. So, biogeochemical adaptations. Once soil floods, oxygen diffusion essentially stops, and you get a reducing and low oxygen environment that would poison most terrestrial plant roots. Wetland plants get around this with erenchyma, that is, internal air channels that pipe oxygen down from the leaves to the roots. Functionally, basically like a snorkel. Meanwhile, the microbial community exploits that same low oxygen condition to run processes you don't see in aerated soils. Denitrification, which strips nitrogen out of the water, and methanogenesis, which produces methane. These are genuinely specialized chemical pathways, not just slowed down versions of normal soil processes. Ecological dynamics. Wetlands aren't static, first of all. They have a successional uh, trajectory, just like any other ecosystem. It just runs on a different time scale. Primary succession starts in open water and sediments, and organic matter slowly infills it over what can be thousands of years, moving towards what is called a reference community, essentially a stable end state for that particular hydrological setting. Then secondary succession, it is the faster version. You can say what happens after a disturbance hits an already established wetland. Fire being the classic example here, as you can see, the system doesn't return to bare ground the way primary succession starts. The water and soil template is still there, so recovery is much quicker. The broader concept underneath both of these is ecological equilibrium, a state held in place by negative feedbacks that keep pulling the system back towards the same configuration even after disturbance. But equilibrium isn't permanent. You see, river dynamics, sea level rise, and now climate change are constantly resetting these systems. So, what looks stable is really a dynamic balance being renewed every cycle. The negative feedback loop. Yes, this diagram gives you a concrete example of a feedback loop in action. And it's actually a case where negative feedback reinforces a problem rather than solving one. Taifa, which is an invasive hybrid cattail in North American wetland. The hybrid here is called Taifa glauca, and it establishes and its litter mass builds up faster. That litter buildup drives down plant species richness because it physically outcompetes native vegetation for light and space. As that happens, soil organic matter and litter depth keeps increasing, which in turn makes conditions even more favorable for more Taifa to establish. Thus, there becomes a negative feedback loop which feeds on itself. It's a loop that keeps reinforcing itself rather than self correcting. And that's exactly why cattle invasions are so hard to reverse once they take hold. The concept of ecological threshold. Now, the bigger idea that this all builds towards threshold. A wetland can absorb a fair amount of stress, like nutrient loading, partial draining, while still holding its ecological character, essentially staying in the same equilibrium basin. But if you cross a threshold and positive feedbacks would definitely take over, and the system can flip into what's called an alternative stable state, that is a clear water marsh turning into turbid and algae dominated, which is the classic example. The diagram here shows this as a ball sitting in one valley, one stable state, until enough push moves it over the ridge into the next valley. And once it's over that ridge, gravity, so to speak, works against you. Reversing the shift usually takes far more intervention than it took to cause it. A few quick global illustrations of the threshold and adaptations in practice, like boreal peatland run on sphagnum moss, actively acidifying its own environment to outcompete anything that isn't adapted to that chemistry. Tidal salt marshes zone themselves out almost entirely on the tension between salt tolerance and tidal energy. You can practically read the stress gradient of the vegetation bands. And arid playas, despite being dry most of the year, they function as critical stopover habitats for migratory species during their brief wet windows. Different constraints, same underlying logic. That is, each system finds its own solution to the flooding problem. Now, we're going to spend the next several slides on the Everglades, mostly following Curtis Richardson's work because it's genuinely one of the best documented examples of everything we have just covered: thresholds, succession, hydrology as massive variable, all happening in one system. Richardson's key reframing is that the Everglades isn't really a marsh in the strict sense. It's better described as a fen peatland, an alkaline marine mire, historically fed by slow sheet flow over limestone under very low phosphorus conditions. That low phosphorus sheet flow baseline is the thing to hold on to into the for the next few slides, because almost every disturbance we'll discuss is really a disturbance to one of those two conditions. This is the original paper of Richardson, which came out in 2010. So just to go around this in the literature, this is the Richardson's paper we are drawing from, published in Wetlands, Ecology and Management. As you can see, it's essentially a synthesis piece pulling together decades of Everglades hydrology, biogeochemistry, and vegetation data. And it proposes a new peatland classification for the system that's meant to inform restoration policy going forward. This map lays out the Everglades, how the Everglades has been carved up administratively. The water conservation area, as you can see in the map, the stormwater treatment area, the Everglades National Park, and the Everglades agricultural area, sitting just south of Lake Okeechobee. What I want you to notice here is how much of the historic Everglades footprint is now agricultural land or engineered water management infrastructure rather than the continuous natural system it once was. Under all of that vegetation is a limestone bedrock with a permeability gradient. Low permeability in the north near Lake Okeechobee, shifting abruptly to highly permeable limestone further south. That gradient controlled the historic drainage direction, and it even shows up in tree island orientation. Because the islands formed along the same flow paths the bedrock was directing water through. So, this isn't just background geology, it's the template the whole hydrological system was built on. A century of rainfall data for southern Florida, smooth to bring out this trend. You can see real multi-decadal swings. A dry stretch through the early 1900s, wetter mid-century, a notable dry period through the 1970s and 80s, then a sharp upswing from the 1990s onward. The point of showing this is that Everglades degradation can't be explained by rainfall alone. The trend doesn't track cleanly with the timing of ecological decline, which is exactly why attention shifts to human hydrological modification instead. This compares phosphorus concentrations at inflow, interior, and outflow points across three water conservation areas plus the park itself. What stands out is the inflow bars. If you see or observe it carefully, consistently far higher than the interior or outflow values, especially in W-001. That's agricultural runoff entering the system, and it's the direct source of the phosphorus loading problem we're about to discuss. The uh, annual phosphorus loads, that is, this tracks phosphorus loads from the Everglades agricultural area over time, with the best management practice implementation phases marked on it. You can see loads spike in the early 1980s, then generally trend downwards as BMPs get progressively implemented, though with real year to year variability. Even with that improvement, outflow concentrations still have exceeded regulatory targets in a number of years. That is the 10 microgram per liter threshold. Richardson's reference is the one that matters ecologically, and getting consistently under it has proven difficult. Now, the vegetation map. Yes, this is a historic snapshot of Everglades vegetation before most of the drainage infrastructure went in. Dense sawgrass marsh, sloughs, tree islands, mangrove fringes along the coast. Sawgrass, which is the dominant species here, is fire adapted and tolerant of low soil nutrients, which is exactly the profile you would expect for a system evolved under phosphorus poor conditions. This map becomes the baseline we compare everything modern against. An aerial shot showing the tree islands scattered through sawgrass and sloughs, with small circular ponds which are clearly visible in this figure. Those ponds are largely fire created and then maintained by alligator activity, which keeps them open. It's a perfect illustration of how disturbance and a keystone species combine to maintain fine scale habitat heterogeneity within what looks from a distance like a fairly uniform marsh. Yes, figure 9. Yes, this diagram is really the mechanistic heart of the Everglades story. Along one axis, you've got increasing hydro period, along the other, increasing soil elevation from peat accretion. Depending on where a patch sits on that grid and depending on fire frequency, you get different endpoints like sawgrass marsh under frequent light fire, bayhead swamp if fire is absent long enough, or worst case, a shift towards upland hardwood species entirely if elevation keeps building and fire keeps getting suppressed. So, vegetation type here isn't fixed, it's a running function of water depth and fire history. This is the side by side historic and present day hydrologic zones. The historic maps shows a fairly continuous gradient of of the flow types. Soligenous fast flow through to no flow, feeding smoothly into mangrove swamp at the coast. The modern map is fragmented into cultivated land, discrete water conservation areas, and managed zones. That fragmentation is really the visual summary of everything the earlier slides have been building towards. That is a continuous flow system broken into disconnected management units. Now, the figure 11. Yes, three flow maps which are in sequence. Historic flow is broad, continuous sheet flow south from Lake Okeechobee all the way to Florida Bay. Current flow is narrow and channelized, redirected mostly east and west rather than south. The planned flow under the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan tries to reconstruct something closer to the historic patterns by reconnecting flow paths and expanding storage. It's worth noting that this is a decades long, multi billion dollar restoration effort, and it's essentially an attempt to undo exactly the fragmentation we just saw in the previous slide. So, pulling the case study together, Richardson's paper synthesized hydrology, nutrient cycling, vegetation succession, and disturbance regimes into a single narrative. How long canals, dikes, and agricultural development disrupted a system that had run on slow sheet flows and low phosphorus for millennia. He documents the spread of invasive melaleuca and the sawgrass to cattail shift, directly tied to phosphorus loading, crossing that 10 microgram threshold. And he frames the whole system as a model for understanding thresholds and resilience under disturbance, which is really why we spent this much time on one wetland actually. Wetland functions and ecosystem service. Okay, we've covered how wetlands work internally. Now the question shifts to what that internal functioning actually does for the systems and people around them. So think of wetlands as capacitors in a watershed. They absorb they absorb a pulse of water during heavy rainfall and release it back out slowly, which is exactly what reduces downstream flood peaks. That's that's actually flood attenuation. The second function here is groundwater recharge. The slow infiltration through wetland soils is often what's actually feeding the aquifers a region depends on for like drinking water and irrigation. Nature's kidney, yes. So the kidney metaphor holds up better than most ecological metaphors do. As water moves through a wetland, sediment settles out and plant debris physically filters pollutants. The more important process chemically is coupled nitrification and denitrification. Bioavailable nitrogen from agricultural or urban runoff gets converted step by step into harmless nitrogen gas. Without that pathway operating at scale, a lot more of that nitrogen would be reaching coastal waters and driving eutrophication. Wetlands cover roughly 6% of the planet's surface, but store a hugely disproportionate share of soil carbon. Peatlands alone hold about twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined. Coastal wetlands add another dimension here through blue carbon, like mangroves and salt marshes. They bury carbon in anoxic sediments at rates per hectare that outpace most terrestrial systems. The flip side is that what happens on drainage? You're not just losing habitat, you're switching previously buried organic matter back into an oxidizing environment, and that carbon starts releasing as CO2 again. Wetlands function as nurseries for a huge share of global fisheries. Roughly 75% of commercially important species in some regions pass through wetland habitats at some life stage. Beyond that, millions of people depend on these systems directly for livelihood, like rice cultivation, fisheries, ecotourism. And this value rarely shows up properly in the GDP accounting, which is partly of why wetland loss has historically been so easy to justify economically, even when the real cost is much higher. So, case study, yeah. This is probably the clearest working example of wetland functions that I know of. 12,500 hectares, and it naturally treats roughly 900 million liters of Kolkata's sewage every single day through a network of sewage fed fish ponds. That save the city something on the order of 4.7 billion rupees a year in treatment infrastructure it would otherwise need to build. And it's not just treatment. The system turns that nutrient loading into 20,000 metric tons of fish and 50,000 metric tons of vegetables annually, while locking away over 60% of the carbon from what wastewater in the process. It's a genuinely circular system, and it's been running this way for generations. Wetland management and conservation. Knowing how wetlands work and what they do for us doesn't automatically tell you how to manage them. That's the last piece. Ramsar's foundational management principle is wise use. That is maintaining a wetland's ecological character through a ecosystem approach within a framework of sustainable development. It's not a preservation only mandate. It explicitly allows continued human use. The hard part practically is defining the limit. How much extraction or modification a system can absorb before its ecological character actually starts to shift, which loops us straight back to the threshold concept from earlier. Integrated watershed management. Older management approached the wetland as an isolated unit. Integrated watershed management treats the entire river basin as the relevant spatial scale instead, because a wetland is really a product of its catchment. The deforest upstream, and you change the sediment load and the hydro period downstream, whether or not you ever touch the wetland itself directly. The IWM coordinates land use and water resources across administrative boundaries on the logic that water doesn't respect a district or state line, even if the management structure does. Wetland management isn't a one time fix, it runs as a cycle of plan, act, monitor, and review. You start by describing the ecological character and setting clear objectives, then implement management actions, then monitor it, and critically, you have to be willing to revise the plan if monitoring shows you're drifting towards a threshold. The adaptive part is the point that treating any management plan as final is usually where things go wrong. Increasingly, the preference is to restore natural processes rather than build hard infrastructure. That is, restoring tidal hydrology in a mangrove system instead of pouring a concrete seawall. For instance, the advantage nature based solutions have over gray infrastructure is that they can actually grow and adjust with rising sea level, whereas a fixed concrete structure just becomes progressively less adequate over time. On the ground, buffer zones are one of the most consistently effective tools, typically somewhere between 30 and 300-meter wide, filtering nutrient runoff and pesticide drift before it reaches the sensitive wetland core. Alongside that, hydrological restoration, removing dikes or levees to re-establish natural sheet flow, exactly like what we saw attempted in the Everglades CERP plan, and active invasive species control, both aimed at keeping the system from sliding into one of those degraded alternative stable states. At the international level, you've got the Ramsar Convention from 1971. Nationally, laws are less stable. The US Clean Water Act, for instance, was significantly narrowed by the Sackett versus EPA Supreme Court decision, which tightened the definition of what counts as protected waters of the United States and left a lot of isolated wetlands outside the federal protection. India's approach has gone the other direction. The 2017 wetland rules introduced a, I quote, zone of influence, unquote, concept and pushed governance down to state wetland authorities, decentralizing rather than narrowing. No management framework survives contact with reality without local buy-in. The three R's here are rights, risk, and responsibilities, mapping out clearly who has what stake, who bears what stake, what risk, and who is accountable for what action. India's Wetland Mitras program and community held fishing rights are both examples of this in practice. Conservation genuinely only holds up when the peoples living on the land are the ones doing the stewarding, not an external authority imposing it. To close the loop on everything today, wetland management is fundamentally iterative, and it only works if you actually understand where the ecological thresholds sit for the system that you're managing. Otherwise, you find out where they were after you've already crossed one. Wetlands loss is currently running at roughly three times the rate of forest loss globally, which is part of why wise use isn't really optional at this point. It's closer to an emergency response. Restoration going forward needs to be guided by indicators that actually track the interaction between organisms and the abiotic template, not just static area count. So these are some suggested readings which I'll leave up for a moment if anyone wants to note down. And I suggest reading at least one or two. It is extremely informative. So thank you for your attention. If anybody has any questions, I will be more than happy to take them in the forum W-001. And please do not create a new forum. Simply post your responses in the present forum. Thank you so much. Have a nice time.